Evening, everybody. Over to Iba Mandaza for this evening's session.
Hello, greetings to all of you who have joined us. Can you all hear me? Chieza?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the sound's a bit low though, but we can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay.
It's
Can
low.
everybody mute except Iba, please?
Okay, greetings to all of you who have joined us for the Surplus Trust Policy Dialogue Forum today. Welcome especially to our panelists, Graciano Mukozongi, an expert, not an understatement, an expert on the land issue in Zimbabwe, having done his PhD on the subject some years ago. And then we have Rusty Markham, who is a former member of parliament, or you are still member of parliament, Rusty. And he was an applicant on the Uchena Report, and you'll talk more about that. And our young scholar, Chieza, who look at the economic implications of the whole thing called the land question. The land question is legendary in Zimbabwe. It was one of the foundational issues of the struggle for independence. It was really the cornerstone of the colonial empire. The colonialization program was based essentially on the disposition of the indigenous people of the land. And that is what the land question is. And it's a question which many would argue has not been fully answered or resolved. Others would argue, and with good reason, that in many respects, the land question has been compounded since 2000, rather than resolved. And those of us who were at Lancaster remember that in September 1979, the Lancaster House talks were almost abandoned, at least suspended for almost a fortnight, over the land question. The nationalists were demanding the resolution of the land question along the lines of its resolution in countries like Kenya and even Zambia. And the conventional form for the resolution of the land question, or the colonial question, was the paying off of the white settlers for the land, which was then, whose possession was now assumed by the state on behalf of the people. That's what happened in Kenya, basically. So conventionally, the Lancaster House Constitution, talks were requiring precisely the same kind of solution, in that the colonial power had to buy off its settlers and have the land returned to the indigenous people of the country. That it did not happen that way in Zimbabwe is a reflection of the power or the respective power of the white settlers themselves. And that has been repeated across the former white settler empire, likewise in Namibia and in South Africa. In the Zimbabwe case, the compromise, as you remember, was that the land issue would be postponed by 10 years, from 1980 to 1990. And I don't recall, maybe Graciano will be able to explain to us. I remember being part of the delegation that went to New York to get the commitment of the US government under Carter. And we met with Andrew Young, who pledged on behalf of his country $1 billion towards the land fund, which was supposed to be matched by the British by £1 billion. That fund would have been that amount designed to pay off the white farmers in Zimbabwe. It was not clearly spelled out, nor was it documented, but it helped to break the impasse of at the Lancaster House talks in September. And the record of the proceedings show that that item was not documented, nor was it followed through. If also because the resolution of the land question was postponed by 10 years, which made it unnecessary or redundant to have the fund. As I said earlier, it's not clear under what circumstances the compromise was made to postpone the land question by 10 years. I can only assume and conclude that it was partly to do with the reticence of the Rhodesian delegation to the talks, supported by the Uzarewa, who was part of the Rhodesia-Zimbabwe equation. As to why, after independence, the new government, which included people like myself, did not tackle this question earlier or prepare for its resolution by 1990, is not clear. It has to do as much with the dynamics of the post-colonial situation, the class factor, and indeed the enduring fear of unsettling the former white settlers in the new Zimbabwe, especially given what the nationalists had seen in Mozambique, in Zambia, and elsewhere. There was as much caution among the nationalists about how to go about the land question as there was the reticence of the white owners, who found comfort, if one might say, in the continuity of the economic structures of the former white settler colonial situation. So that is the background. How the 2000 fast-track land reform process began is legion, and whether that was a solution is also well documented, as Graciano will outline, but more in detail, Rusty Markham will be looking at there were at least 9 land audits from 2001, I think, 2003, the Uchena land audit, and right through to the Uchena Report, 2018, to which Rusty Markham will address himself. So, with that broad introduction, I now ask Graciano to take up the theme. Graciano, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Mandat. Hi, everyone. I'm going to do a brief analysis of Zimbabwe's land and agrarian question, starting back from the 1979 Lancaster Agreement, which of course provides a backdrop to the dynamics that shaped the way in which the newly independent state of Zimbabwe in 1980 undertook the most difficult process of addressing the historical injustices embedded in Zimbabwe's agrarian sector, which it inherited from colonialism. I need to preface this by just saying that land reforms, historically, land reforms are by their nature elite-driven processes. And it is that fact that must be considered when we think of the dynamics that sought to influence Zimbabwe's transition to independence and the land reforms that were to be undertaken under a newly independent Zimbabwe. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the 1979 Lancaster House Conference, but I want to highlight some of the dynamics that were highlighted by Dr. Mandaza in terms of the restrictions that were imposed on the ability of the new government in Zimbabwe to undertake broad-based land and agrarian reforms in favor of the historically marginalized Black population. So the 10-year moratorium that was imposed under the transitional agreement was that in the aftermath of independence, Zimbabwe was not able to undertake a non-market driven or revolutionary process of acquiring and redistributing lands to the marginalized Black population. The implications for those was that it was very difficult especially for ZANU-PF, which during the liberation struggle had made a lot of promises to the Blacks that in the aftermath of independence, stolen lands will be returned to the Blacks who had suffered colonial era racialized injustices where they were moved to agroecologically poor soils, especially in the periphery of the country. So what you saw after independence was that the land reform was guided by market forces, meaning that the government had to pay for land acquired and under market conditions or under what so-called willing seller, willing buyer basis. This was to happen for the first 10 years of independence, from 1980 up to 1990. And of course, the number speaks for themselves. There was insignificant amounts of land which were transferred under this restrictive period because the government could not forcibly acquire lands to the minority white landowners who had retained the lands in the aftermath of independence. So between 1980 and 2000, very little land changed hands. Insignificant amount of land were transferred from white landowners to the Black populations. Of course, that created problems for the ruling ZANU-PF party that by 1990, there were a lot of problems around increasing rural poverty because of people continuing to farm on ecologically degraded lands, while most of the fertile lands were retained by a minority of white farmers. So of course, after 1992, we had the Land Acquisition Act, which of course liberated Zimbabwe from the transitional era restrictions, which didn't allow the government to acquire the land for 10 years, basically on the basis of the safeguards that were agreed during the transitional era. Of course, there's an open debate around who was to fund the land reform. I think during 1979, to discussions that led to the Lancaster House Agreement, there were a lot of promises, a lot of them unfulfilled, including those by the Americans, who sought to sort of create a very positive picture of oh, well, if Zimbabwe, became independent, they were going to fund Zimbabwe, partly fund Zimbabwe's land reform, and that funding will be matched by the British. But what we understand in terms of how the American system works, it has to, that decision must have congressional approval. So far, we are not aware of any congressional law that were passed with regards to compensating white farmers in Zimbabwe, which means that was just some talks, but with no solid commitment by the Americans. The British themselves did commit as the colonizer or the sponsor of the colonial project in the then Rhodesia to fund some of the land reforms, but under the market conditions. So some of the funding came, but I think a lot of the funding that was committed was not forthcoming until the 1990s, when the land debate heated up, coupled with a lot of other political developments that took place in Zimbabwe. We don't have time to explore those, but what we must focus here is that the land issue got radicalized in the 1990s. And when the land issue was radicalizing, that is the time also when the Zimbabwe faced a lot of economic headwinds, including adoption of an IMF-funded economic structural adjustment program, which is ironic in the sense that the time when Zimbabwe got liberated from the Lancaster House restrictions in redistributing land, Zimbabwe adopted a very neoliberal microeconomic policy, which of course favored the protection of property rights as a conditionality to getting loans and making sure that the government would not be seen as confiscating what was viewed as private property. So you can see the dynamics which are in conflict with each other in the 1990s. But what we can say here, given the dynamics and the time restrictions, is that the ZANU-PF government under Mugabe was much more liberated from the Lancaster House restrictions, and hence it explored some radical approaches to the land issue, but at the same time wanting to please the IMF in order to commit to the requirements of the IMF loan, which had imposed economic structural adjustment programs on the country as a condition for some financial relief. Now, until up to 1996, 1997, we saw the government dramatically listing over 1,400 farms for acquisition. And then that heated up to 1998 when the donors conference happened, which sought to mobilize funding for a more orderly land reform, which did not involve confiscation of property without compensation. So again, you could see that after 1990, the land reform issue got radicalized. ZANU-PF wanted to address it because very little land had also transferred hands, especially within the first 10 years of independence. So that created problems for the ruling party in terms of legitimacy. And mind you, being aware that ZANU-PF have benefited historically from rural voters, which is a major part of its constituents of voters. And those people were disgruntled. And we also have to highlight here the problem of regular droughts. Zimbabwe suffers regular droughts, and this is historical. During the pre-colonial era, this was called the Shangwe. So the Shangwa was a word meaning that a lot of times the country would go through some droughts, and even during the Rhodesia time from 1890 up to 1980, Zimbabwe has always suffered some droughts. So in the immediately after independence, there was a drought. In the 1990, there was a serious drought. So droughts also aggravated the rural population, which struggled, especially during those times in terms of drought relief. So in any way, back to the land question, we do see that the land reform, the land debate radicalized until 2000, also influenced by other factors in terms of ZANU-PF wanting to remain in power, mobilizing the rural population, also making overtures to the rural population in terms of addressing persistent land injustices, which had persisted after 1980. Now, we go to 2000 when things heated up. with the referendum that took place in Zimbabwe, in which the ruling party lost. But I tend to have a different view. I don't necessarily attribute the implementation of the fast-track land reform to ZANU-PF's failure to win the constitutional whatever debate in 2000. I think it's an exaggeration to say that, because I think even without that referendum, the land occupations were going to take place. Anyone who has started the radicalization of the land issue in Zimbabwe will see that by 1999, the population, including the war veterans, were already aggravated, that whatever would happen, land occupations were going to take place if the government did not lead a radical land reform process. So the referendum was just an event. I don't necessarily think even if they won it, they were going to stop anything. I think there was already momentum for the radicalization of the land issue in Zimbabwe. In any way, what I want to highlight here is that the Lancaster House Agreement reflects two things. The first is that land reforms are elite processes. They are never, if they are not revolutionary, they are normally driven by political elites who do some horse trading with whoever owns the land. So land transfers to the poor are always politically charged. They are also driven by legal debates. The people with existing land rights will never give those land rights without a fight. And we saw with the white farmers in Zimbabwe, they negotiated during the Lancaster House Agreement to retain land holdings. And the British, who had sponsored colonialism, had a template of restricting land transfers in post-colonial countries, i.e. in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, in South Africa, in Kenya. The list goes on. Kenya had a different model in which there was a fund created to compensate the white farmers. Unlike Zimbabwe, we didn't have a specific fund. Whatever got promised was never paid up. So I want to highlight that land reforms are elite-driven processes, and by their nature, I want to argue that political elites will be interested in cutting deals with the existing landowners in order to find a political settlement. So the Lancaster House Agreement is a classic example of elite pacting. By that I mean elites agreeing on a way forward which does not necessarily pursue the radicalization of a agrarian structure inherited from colonialism. So that is the problem that ZANU-PF faced. By agreeing to the Lancaster House restrictions, it was essentially tying itself to an agreement that would not help it in addressing the land issue. Now, by 2000, what we see is the radicalization of the land issue, including elements of the state that are radicalized, that allows for the massive occupations of farms and their redistribution. And this was not by any chance a perfect process, but the land question had been liberated from elites by the time. But it got also hijacked because within that revolutionary movement, war veterans and others, we also that eventually the land reform process, which was radicalized, got hijacked by political elites. As I said, this is why I preface that all land reforms are driven by elite interests, and also they are underpinned by class dynamics. We call those class dynamics of agrarian change. By that I mean that whenever you occupy lands, and if grassroots groups who are forcibly acquire land, the legal question will loom. If you acquire land, what type of property regime are you going to assume? So this is the problem. We are not going to be bogged down in terms of what happened under the fast-track land reforms, but we want to highlight some of the things that happened. During that land reform, which was a world-changing event, over 10 million hectares changed hands with very minimal involvement of the government. It's important to highlight that this was a revolutionary process, whether you like it or not, that's not the point. It was a revolutionary process, but it was not free from the class dynamics which had influenced the way in which the land question in Zimbabwe had been handled. Because at some point after the war, veterans had led a massive process of land redistribution, order had to be restored. We call that the planning phase of the land reform, which started in 2003. And that phase was to legalize the process and to bring order and to seek international legitimacy, given the fact that Zimbabwe faced international isolation, faced sanctions as a result. So there's always been an attempt to sanitize the revolutionary land reform by appealing to the sort of international structure to say, look, the land reform was necessary, but we want to sanitize, we want to make it as palatable as possible, but without returning the land back to the minority white landowners. So that's the problem. And this is a problem where at some point, of course, Rusty will talk about the BIPPA farms, but the BIPPA farms themselves at some time were overtaken. The bilateral investment, whatever agreements, were overtaken by the revolutionary moment of the land reform because those farms were redistributed and they had to be recovered at some point. But it can show you the revolutionary nature of the land reform. But of course, we want to highlight that within that revolutionary nature at some point, elites, political elites and other groups, very influential in policy making, did acquire large farms, some of which have not been properly utilized, and that remains a problem in terms of productivity. Now, the tenure debate is under Mugabe, there was a problem. Once the land was redistributed, the tenures were a problem. What do we do? Do we go back to the market or not? It's a fundamental question because then it relates to what has just happened now in Zimbabwe. We have always argued, under Mugabe, we saw that Mugabe was very reluctant to allow the return of land to the markets. That is why various tenure documents were produced, offer letters, 1990 leases and others. It was the reluctance to give people freehold tenure. And the problem was, if people acquired land for free, how do you give them title deeds? Because by giving them title deeds, it's now because you are taking land back to the market. There was an arrangement, especially for A2 farmers, to pay for developments at their farms and build a fund that could compensate white farmers. But at the same time, the government was reluctant to give these people title deeds because it was afraid that if you open up the land to freehold tenure, some clever Toms will come and recover all the land from the poor. And we go back to where we were in terms of land concentration among economic elites and other politically connected individuals. So that's been the problem. And we have raised that in a lot of publications. What do we do with land tenure after the land reform? I think some of us have been very supportive of the kinds of offer letters, especially for A1 farms. The argument that freehold tenure improves agricultural productivity is not based on facts. I think the tobacco sector is testimony to my arguments that those people don't have title deeds, but now smallholder tobacco farmers are the major producers of the crop, but they don't have title deeds. We see a lot of people with title deeds who are not able to produce. Of course, there's a problem of agricultural financing in Zimbabwe, but I think it's not true to say that if you globalize the issuance of land titles, you are going to see agricultural productivity going up. I think, yes, you allow especially capitalist farmers in the A2 sector mortgaging the land to get agricultural loans. But even under Rhodesia, there was a lot of problems with the so-called titled farmers who continued to rely on grants and other state instruments to outcompete indigenous farmers who were not funded. So even under Rhodesia, the 1934 Grain Whatever Act was a direct act to sabotage black farmers who didn't have title to their land but were competing with white farmers. So the whole tenure debate is not based on facts. It's not that I'm against, I think, land titles. I think people should be given titles. But those titles are not based on some idea that if you give people title, they will be productive. Now, where are we now? In short, I want to wrap up. I think the land question in Zimbabwe is persistent. Where we are now, there is a problem of the tenure debate. The tenure debate itself is an elite-driven debate because it's the politically connected individuals and other elites who have been complaining to the government that we are not able to leverage our land holdings to get loans to invest in our land. But we have seen what these elites have done. I think the government has come up with a lot of programs to empower these farmers. The farm mechanization program under Gono, there's a list of people who have not committed to repaying some of the farm implements they were given. We have also seen that even the farmers that acquired title deeds were not able to leverage those to gain loans and so forth. So where we are now is we now have a process where we are moving towards giving people title after those people pay for the land and so forth and agreed arrangements. I think the fear among a lot of people now is that this is going to be a land grab. I think we need to look at the details, the legal processes that are taking place. Again, you see the elites coming in to dominate the process of the land reform, and the fears around a land grab are real, because I think there is need for a national debate on the issue of the land tenure process that are unfolding now. I think that debate needs to open so that citizens can participate, especially those that we have not benefited from the land reform. And I want to preface the global agreement, which committed 3.5 billion to former white farmers. It's an outstanding issue. Again, we see elites influencing that. The return of the 7 BIPPA farms is another contentious issue, because it happens at a time when Zimbabwe is renegotiating with the IMF to gain some financial support. So we feel that the IMF and other external lobbyists have influenced Zimbabwe towards the global agreement to compensate white farmers and the return of the BIPPA farmers. All these are elite-driven processes. We also see the hand of international capital influencing policy moves towards reconciling with the so-called neoliberal order, where the government is being told that if you don't compensate the white farmers, we won't extend loans to you. So we think that the IMF and others are central to the debate, because Zimbabwe is currently negotiating a staff-monitored program under the IMF, and we feel that the announcement of returning the 67 BIPPA farms is a genuflection to IMF requirement on the issue of protection of private property rights. Again, this is similar to what happened in 1979. One could argue that what has happened in Zimbabwe, especially with BIPPA farms and all attempts to compensate white farmers, are influenced by the idea that we need to protect the private property rights of white farmers at the expense of the majority black population, which at any point needed to recover the properties. So I think, in short, I want to highlight that the land reform process in Zimbabwe has been elite-driven. It has also been driven by external actors like Western governments and the IMF and others, who has an interest in promoting agrarian injustices in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and other countries in the region. I think the way forward is to find a way of addressing the land tenure issue without promoting a land grab. I think there are so many Zimbabweans who haven't benefited from the land reform. I think any process around land tenure should involve also extending land, acquiring farms that are derelict and that are not being used, or taking land from those, especially political elites and others, that have multiple farms, and allowing for broadening access to land to those Zimbabweans who have not yet benefited from the land reform. Mind you, the burden of repaying white farmers is a national burden. So is it just that people who haven't benefited from the land reform are also involved in compensating white farmers? I mean, those people who have benefited from the land reform, it makes sense for them to compensate, but a lot of Zimbabweans haven't benefited from the land reform. So why should they be involved in the compensation of white farmers? I think it's unjust. And I think the move to retain farms, BIPPA farms, it's a good move, especially if you want to impress the international order. But it's also unjust for people in Zimbabwe who have not benefited from the land reform. I think those things must be addressed as we address the broader land tenure debate. I think I'll end here to allow for some further discussions.
Thanks, Graciano. Thanks very much for that outline. Just, do you have a record of how many farms were repossessed from the whites altogether, and what proportion of those farms has gone to the landless, i.e. the A1, and what proportion has gone to the elites, i.e. the A2?
Good question. I don't think I have them at the top of my head, but I know that the entire land reform process transferred over 10 million hectares of land. And within that, I think the top lands, the bigger percentage of the land, I think around 70 to 80% went to landless people. I think within the 20% bit, that's where we have most of the productive lands in rich agroecological areas. So elites, of course, within government and others who benefited from the land reform tend to have acquired most of the productive land within favorable agroecological conditions. But in terms of numbers, in terms of broader numbers, the beneficiaries of land reform were largely peasants and others. But one must also look at what land went to who and what agroecological locations these lands were. So when you see most of the lands that were taken from, which are causing a lot of problems, and the lobbying from people like Ben Frith and others, are lands in favorable agroecological regions. And these lands, if you look at the identities of people who took those lands, tend to be business and political elites who benefited from the infrastructure and properties on these farms. So actually, if you look at it, they don't represent the majority of the land acquired, but they represent rich agroecological land. So we need to clarify that. And also, I need to clarify that if you study the agroecological lands in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is not a country with rich agricultural land. The rich agricultural land is a tiny percentage of the total lands, you see. So the lamentations of white farmers, especially within these rich agroecological regions, is that these were the most productive lands which were taken over by politicians who were not able to utilize them productively. So that is important to highlight, that rich agroecological lands were targeted by political elites because there was an idea that for you to acquire these lands, you needed to match the productivity levels of the former owners. That, in theory, that was the idea. So, and also
would you say, in terms of the value of those farms taken over by the elites, in terms of the value of those farms, would you say that the value thereof is enough to constitute the compensation fund?
A study has to be done, but I would argue that actually, because a lot of these lands, if those lands were their value, if evaluation has been done, I think there were guys who were doing the valuation. I think the Minister of Lands will have that information. I think in terms of valuations, these lands could raise a ton of money that is able to compensate people, especially the white farmers. If the Uchena Report, what we know about it, if it is claiming that peri-urban land across Zimbabwe was worth almost around 3 billion, the ones that was acquired for urban resettlement, how about these farms? I think if you value these farms at market value, you are able to raise quite a ton of money for compensation. Those farms in the agroecologically rich areas are enough if you value them. I might be wrong. I think a study has to be done to see at the valuation process and what kind of valuation you can take. But I'm sure they are adequate to compensate white farmers.
Would you agree, to my last question for this round, would you agree that the land question has been compounded or replicated to the extent that you have a new elite, in the same way that the white settler component owning land, which has now been overtaken by a black elite, that you have a new land question, because tomorrow people will be asking those who have inherited from their parents these free farms, that in fact these need to be liberated in turn. Do we have a new land question in your view?
I totally agree. I think we have a new elite that is sitting on very productive land. There is land hoarding among this elite, and I think this land should be a target for further redistribution. But now, given the dynamics shaping the land question in terms of this whole bank-driven titling, I don't see that happening very soon. I think we have the land reform process in Zimbabwe is a continuous process. It's a live. What's happening now, we would see it unraveling in the near future if these unjust land holdings are left like they are, because I think the current system of land tenuring is also promoting the sort of concentration of land among an elite group of people. I think the way it is going, it's going to be subject to further contestations going forward. We never know where the politics will go. I think let's never assume that the land question in Zimbabwe is over. It's not over by any chance. I think there will be further contestations given that agrarian injustices in Zimbabwe are persisting. I think there is an attempt even to reverse some of the gains of the land reform process under the current debate that is taking place. And I think that will create a powder keg for further contestations over land.
Thanks, Graciano. I'll get back to you. Sekuru, Rusty, your turn now. You can take up some of the questions I've raised with Graciano, but I think,
okay.
What is your assessment of the land question in Zimbabwe? To what extent has it been resolved? And what are the outstanding issues?
I think
has benefited from the land redistribution or land reform, and who are the losers?
I'd like to pick up from what Doc's just said there. A lot of it I agree with. You know, the problem with us here in Zim, if we want to sort out the problem, we've got to sort it out together. And the only way you do that is with the same laws and the same for everyone. Now the problem with this is very simple. In their attempt to sort out the agrarian reform problems, the government are actually not only are they compounding the issue, they're also contradicting themselves in numerous fashion and numerous things. On the A1 and A2, I think the figures are 2/3, 1/3, with the eyes of the beast staying with the A2 farmers. Now the problem with that is the selection of the A2 farmers were on a whole on a political orientation base. It wasn't for the people. The A1s, they got the fringe benefits and obviously smaller ones. Now the problem with that, which we haven't mentioned, and I'm talking sort of recent, 2015 to 2018, in those 4 years, there was an overrun of the national budget by $8.3 billion, which came before the parliamentary committee, audit committee, where I was sitting there, chaired by Honorable Beatty. Of that, 5.4 billion was overrun on the agricultural reform side. Now I understand that you had to do it, but that is a typical example of removing the value of land because you put it under state, and there's no collateral value for the farmer. So it's not an issue of whether the new farmers are not as good as the old farmers. The bottom line is the new farmer who came in there had no collateral value where he could borrow. And that's the idea with title, not necessarily for farming only, but for hunting concessions, for mining. If you want to attract foreign direct investment, if you want to get into agro processing and that, you have to borrow offshore. And you have to get a partner from offshore, and you've got to attract them. And it's not a matter of just us, it's the whole of SADC. Don't forget, in SADC, we unfortunately haven't progressed into a community as such, in the context that An investor looks at the neighboring countries and he'll pick the best one for his money and his investment. And we're not there yet. So that's what I've got to say to that. The other thing I'd like to just point out is the issue of the whole land issue. If we work together, we can get out of this, and we can get it so that it's a level playing field with assistance for those who can't afford. So we all get it. Because I just want to pick up what you said earlier, Iba. The issue of land being taken from the indigenous people in the early days, that's fine. But in my thing at the deeds office, I found about 850 title deeds, including urban deeds, in the whole of what was Southern Rhodesia, were given out to the pioneer columns and the early people. Now, since independence, where there was over 6,000 farmers, we're down to about 4,400 white-owned title deeds, of which 60% had changed hands since independence. So 60%, 69%, exactly 69% of title deeds have changed hands since independence. Okay, now that's with the approval of the government. And yes, I understand the politics behind that. The other point I'd just like to bring, and I thank Dr. for bringing this up. This issue of promises from the British and the Americans, and it's not documented, it is a flaw, and we've got to accept that. But there's no reason why we can't go and pick that up together with the British, with the Americans, and say, you got to help us with this, because it's a hereditary mess. And the issue is this: the British actually did start, and under the Blair government, they stopped the willing seller, willing buyer basis on what they grounded as nepotism and corruption. There's no reason why the government of today can't go back with a unified force. We go back and we discuss these issues in order to solve the issue once and for all. No one's going to plow money into Zimbabwe if we don't solve the core issue, and that is that everyone gets a fair chance at it. So those were my comments on what Doc and yourself said in the early stages. Can I go ahead? You muted, Baba.
Sorry. Now, carry on, please.
So can I go into my...
You have just started.
Yeah, that's right. So what I'd like to draw attention to is from 2000 onwards. Basically, we are aware that we've had numerous land audits of this country. We started in 2003 with the Flora Booker audit. We then had the Uchena Report. We had Chiweshe and Chiwewe. We had the Presidential Land Resettlement Scheme. A lot of these were not published. Okay, one was not formally published. The others were not published. The first one, the Flora Booker one, is actually listed here as never published, brackets secret. Then the funded ones like the Zimbabwe Land Commission pilot audit and the National Agricultural Land Audit, those were completed, they were donor funded. But they being completed doesn't mean that we're going to take the advice or go into it. But the one that I really want to go on to is the Justice Uchena Report, which came in straight after the 2018 elections. And it was done by Justice Uchena and handed over to the President on the 19th of December 2019. Okay, so the conclusion of all these audit reports are not necessarily repetitive, but they're the same things coming up and up. Land being given to the ruling elite, land being given to the same people, no compliance with one man, one farm, irregular allocations, nepotism. You can go through them all. They all come up with that. The differential ones were the one which is slightly different is the Justice George Chiweshe and Chiwewe Inter-Ministerial Committee, where they suggested in land reform that BIPPA farms were protected, They should leave alone. They should give consideration to export processing zones and forestry estates and agro-based industries. But be that as it is, we are where we are today. So I'd like to look in detail at the Justice Uchena Report. Now, the Justice Uchena Report has got a little bit of a timeline in that we started once it had been handed to the president. I brought it up in Parliament over 20 times, and that's no exaggeration. I have the Hansard where I said 23 times, but I brought it up 20 times asking for the Justice Uchena Report to be published. I had the Minister of Justice, Zimbabwe, tell me categorically he would personally make sure it happened. I had the Speaker of Parliament saying he'd chase it up with the President, and basically they set out the 5 years that we were there and nothing happened. And one of the last retorts when I left Parliament was, if you don't like it, take it to court. Well, we did. Now, the issue is for the Justice Uchena Report to be released and for the ruling to be in favor of the litigant, and also for the President of Zimbabwe to actually say that it must be released, as he did in the beginning of May, is actually a phenomenal step in the right direction. And I just want to identify the difference between the rural land and the urban land. The Justice Uchena Report covers land both peri-urban and urban. Now, the urban land was not covered by land reform. That property development should have happened under the laws that were pertaining to the urban areas. The peri-urban, you can argue either way. But the issue is the Justice Uchena Report clearly stated that the value is $3.004 billion worth of land, of farms that have been taken. Now, that land is made up of both state and commercial farms. A lot of these people had land which already had a development permit on it, in other words, to urbanize. But these were taken over and handed over by the then Minister of Local Government. I must just explain, the Minister of Local Government obviously covered the urban area when it came to land and local governance, obviously. But when it came to rural areas, the land falls under the Ministry of Agriculture at the time. So the Ministry of Local Government, at that time, the minister was Honorable Chombo. And under that, the issue was that this land was issued directly by state. Now, what should happen? What should happen is any land should be ceded by the state to local government to do the plans, to do the infrastructural plans, and then hand it out or sell it. What happened was, and rightly so, the city of Arrears had no money to do this infrastructural development. Government was short of funds as well. So they decided to get developers who would put in the infrastructure, and then after the infrastructure was in, sell off the land to recoup the money. Well, it went the other way around. The land was sold off, the infrastructure wasn't built, and the land barons, as we call them, or the cooperatives, or the developers, all took the money. Government, by the Justice Uchena Report, got less than 10% of the intrinsic value of the land. So that brings the total figure to just under $3 billion of the land that requires. So the Justice Uchena Report, and it's very well summarized, it's very well written, but it has, like all these land issues, have a flaw. It is totally reliant on the people reporting to you. So while I recommend it, I must also recommend the president in issuing that it must come out, because this is a point in the right direction, because it's going to talk of the elites that are taking. I know one land baron who had a development program in Beitbridge, in Karoi, and in Hatcliffe in Arrears. The same guy. Now that is the issue, and this shows the problem we have. But the people who are on the ground, the people who benefited and got their little stands to build on, etc., they are paying a rent, and they are still paying a rent. There's no reconciliation in a lot of these things, and they are still paying. I have domestic workers who've come to see me who have been paying rent since 1998, and they are still paying rent. $30 a month, but it's rent. So these are the issues. So if I can just mention on the Justice Uchena report, it's in three parts. The main report goes down to provincial reports. Now, the appendix to the Justice Uchena report is one per province, which is very good. And then obviously the executive summary. In his handover report, he summarizes it very well. But before I get on to that, I just want to point out that the actual Justice Uchena report to date has not been released. All we have is the executive report and a couple of tidbits from the press, but the actual Uchena report in its entirety has not been released. I have had sight to a couple of pages only, which were bad photocopies, but the ones I saw, which I recognized, is pretty damning. It lists everyone by name, right from the minister down, of who was involved in the particular thing and who got what. Now that is a phenomenal document. I know it took quite a while to do it, but he's done a good job. And the fact that that is going to be released, I commend those involved in it. The summary of findings talks of handover farms for urban development. The interesting thing here, there are 91 farms which were acquired by the ministry. There are further 79 farms which were acquired by government or government organs, talking of about 170 urban farms that have been identified and in this report. The 170 farms are what comes to the total value. The payment of intrinsic value is one of the many things that we've got to look at and see what it is. The infrastructure development. Now, when we get to the infrastructure development, this is where we now start taking a hiding. As Dr. G said, we start taking a hiding where everyone now starts having to pay for this debt. The infrastructure development, there are no roads. I'm reading the report. No roads, water reticulation, no sanitary sewer, and no amenities. Now, the problem with this, his estimation, which he clearly states here, for the urban settlements is there's $1.42 billion required for roads. $1.42 billion for roads. $857 million for the sewerage, and $226 million for the water. I can't understand why the water is so low, but that might be because some of the water budgets, for example, Kunzui Dam is budgeted under another ministry and is already in process. So the total there, apart from 3 billion, the infrastructure development, the bare minimum infrastructure development required, is another $2.5 billion. Now, as was formerly said, the problem we have with that is that the taxman has to pay for that. But the value should be in the intrinsic value. The intrinsic value of land should be able to pay for the capital development of infrastructure that's required. But we have this is where I say it's compounded and confused, because now we have people who've been paying for 20 years for the land and they don't own it. We've got very little intrinsic value left in the land because the guys paid so much, and we've got no infrastructure. So the government now starts looking for money for infrastructure for this, and it just increases on the debt burden. I don't know if you've noticed in the last 5 years, if you look at the debt burden, it's increased on average by 2 billion per year. And there's no reason to think it's going to be any different, despite increased gold, despite increased tobacco, despite everything like that, we still have this problem. So the other findings which are interested there is that it's the reoccurrence of names and the reoccurrence of the modus operandi for the taking of these farms. But I want to highlight one interesting one, which is in paragraph 5 here, or in chapter 5, is creation, abuse of political office and allocation in the allocation and appropriation of state land, particularly by members of parliament aspiring and sitting, and a creation of a new urban wealth. Now that is showing a reflection of what's happening in town with exactly what's happened in the rural areas. So what's happening in town is what's happening in the rural areas. There is another report which has nothing to do with agriculture, but would be phenomenal reading side by side with this Justice Uchena report, will be the recently done Justice Cheda report on the Commission of Inquiry into the corruption in the city of Arrears, because that cuts out all the politics. It's everyone involved in that. My concern in the next chapter is on the statistics and cases recommended for further investigation by Justice Uchena. Cases for further investigation in Arrears province, 156. Mashonaland Central, 25. Mashonaland East is 120. Now we're talking of the rich belt of the agricultural areas and the periphery of the agricultural areas, i.e. peri-urban. Mashonaland West is 50, Midlands, Manicaland going to the lower 20s, and Matt North and South go even lower on that. Now, he gives specific recommendations to ministries, numerous ministries, but the top two are obviously the Minister of Local Government, where it's basically saying the laws are there, they weren't applied. And the Minister of Lands, there's a whole host of recommendations, which I won't go into because they are voluminous, and we will see them when we get the proper report. And then there's 6 or 7 other ministries which are taxed. But what I do like is he calls to book the Ministry of Home Affairs. He calls to book the Anti-Corruption Commission. He calls to book the Judicial Service Commission, etc., etc. The general comments and the general recommendations are also concerning, because we've got to start looking at the general thing. It was adhered to in the report on the rural farms on the issue of climate change, on the issue of water. And we have a problem. If you look at Arrears is on the top. It's an upland thing. We don't have big catchment area for our dams, but we concentrating a huge population on the top end of that. So the report ends in a recommendation which is very close to my heart, and it's a special purpose vehicle. The report is looking at a special bill, if you like, or a special act of parliament, where it creates a vehicle to regularize the illegal or the informal settlements of the thing, where I keep referring to Hatcliffe because I know it well. Hatcliffe would be taken out of the ministries, and there'd be a special fund and a special development to regularize that area. And you do that for all so you're regularizing the irregular settlements. And where I was astounded, I've been involved with not reporting, but meeting with the consultants for the Arrears master plan. That specific point is not tackled. The broad parameters saying it must be regularized, that's not a master plan. That's just a parameter. We need that. We need those things because they tie into major issues we got in Arrears. For example, mass transport. For example, a metropolitan railway. For example, the sewer farms is 2,500 hectares where we're supposed to be pumping the sewage onto. That is archaic. There are far more modern areas which would relinquish or release a huge block of land to help formalize and be pro-poor for city of Arrears. All these, you need a special purpose vehicle to do that, and we don't have that. So that is the Justice Uchena report in its essence. I implore the powers that be for the report to be released, because it will be a major step in us getting together and trying to sort out the land issue. We've got to sort out the land issue in its entirety. We had the Minister of Agriculture stand up the other day, and he talked about the rural lands, and I'd like to cover that. He talks of 408 commercial farmers, white commercial farmers, getting their land back. Those are basically the commercial farmers that are still on their land, who have not been taken off their land. Now they're on their land as a proportion or total of a smaller farm, but it's about 408, and that figure is pretty accurate. The minister then goes on to BIPPA. Now I'll just cover BIPPA very briefly, because I have a major problem with BIPPA. The BIPPA has been sorted, it's been signed, and it comes to about 160 million, which in the essence of the 3.5 is a teaspoon. But there is no one telling us which 67 out of about 140 farms, which 67 are and who's got them, what nationality are they? Because that's what the bilateral investment protection program is about, is that it's a joint protection by the government of Zimbabwe and the foreign nationals' home thing. Now, are they funding it? Are we funding it? Yes, it's in our budget. I don't argue that. But where's the money coming from? And why I asked the question, when I was in Parliament, I picked up that one of the court cases which was heard in Europe, which was Fanakota versus the government of Zimbabwe, in which the courts ruled in favor of the applicants, the government of Zimbabwe had to pay that. There is a loan in our loan book for $30 million given to us by the Dutch farmers to pay that court case. Now, if that arrangement could be carried across the rest of the BIPPA farmers, we can then look at why should we be paying back that loan. But the sad thing about that, our own government has not run that through Parliament. They are short-circuiting the whole land reform, the 3.5, everything. It's not even been debated in Parliament. No one can tell me about a debate. I certainly didn't participate. The issue of that is very simple. We've got to domesticate that if it's going to be a debt. They bring it up at the budget time and they say there's 3.5 for the farmers, and because you passed the budget, they say you've passed and acknowledged the debt. That's not true, because the Senate does not debate the budget. So, but that's a fight for another day. So the transparency on the BIPPA deal leaves a lot to be desired. Now we go on to, and I just want to compare this. So you understand with BIPPA, they're paying the full development price, they're paying for land, and they're putting a token in for time value for money, human rights, etc., etc. But my question is, in the meantime, we've got offer letters to other guys who've been put on those farms. Who takes that responsibility? That's another cost. But the one that everyone's ignored in any discussion is another issue which I brought up only 7 times in Parliament, is the black, and I'm sorry, I've got to use color here because we all talk indigenous farmers, some are white, some are black. The black indigenous farmers who were evicted off their land, I had a figure of 247. Now, they were covered by Instrument 62 of 2020, I think, and that was cancelled last year by the statutory instrument 135 of 25. But they were offered a 99-year lease. Now, that guy bought his farm. He got evicted, whether it was personal, political, or just because they could, they did. I had a figure of 427 talking to a couple. Now, the indigenous farmer has been very, very badly, the black indigenous farmer has been very badly let down in this whole issue for 2 reasons. One, they can't formally object and publicly object to their land being taken because they have other running businesses here which they're totally dependent on. When I brought up the figure in Parliament, the Honourable Minister of Agriculture corrected me and said there's 650 farmers in this category, and that they'd been given 99-year leases, or some of them had. I have checked with those farmers and none to my knowledge have got. So he upped it to 650. In his speech 3 weeks ago, he talked of 850. Now, those farmers would be ideal to give their land back or portion of their land back so they can get on with it. But now let's compare the two. The indigenous black farmer, the indigenous white commercial farmer, and BIPPA. I've already told you what BIPPA are getting. The white farmer's value for development was just under $8 billion, plus the land, which was valued at 3.2, call it 9 billion altogether. It's not, those figures aren't right, but call it 9 billion. That was cut down to 3.5 as a fire sale, which was land out, because that's the British problem. And then they took out biological and land clearing, and then they halved it. So the actual development price that the white commercial farmer is getting or being offered under the FCA or the previous document, the Global Settlement Deed, is 41.4% of actual development, no land and no other consideration. Okay. Now, the black indigenous farmer has been off his land for 20 years. He hasn't got any offer. In my view, he's got no material offer in front of him. He's got no organization. I know most of them have no valuation and no one to represent them. But no one talks about them. And that's a major issue. So we've now got 3 different setups. Then there are 2 more court cases. I've talked about Fanakota court case. We've got the Van Pessel court case, which is held in the States, which also ruled against government. And yes, those are European courts, etc., etc. But don't forget, one of the first court cases that we had was ruled by the SADC Tribunal, which ruled in favor of Mike Campbell versus the government. And they closed the SADC Tribunal down so that the ruling could not be implemented. Now, the issue with that is that was the time to get down to the table and resolve the whole issue so that everyone had the same treatment under the law of Zimbabwe. So we go on to what I believe, and it's my belief only, the fourth deal is the Global Settlement Deed transformed into the, when government couldn't pay after the first 4 years, they went under PROFCA and the Farmers Compensation Agreement, taking over basically the same. Now, that agreement is 1% interest for the first 4 years, and then 1% capital interest per year, and then they pay you off over 4 to 6 years, your capital. But your capital, when you sign on, your compensation, when you sign on, your compensation is now held in a government bond, guaranteed in US dollars. So we're now talking of a local issue being guaranteed by a bond in US dollars. Where I have a problem with that is we all know what's happened in the mining sector with, well, not only the mining sector, of all government parastatals being brought under the Sovereign Wealth Fund and then moved into Motapa Investments. But if we look at Kavimba, we know what happened at Kavimba. The assets were bought in 2019 for about $19 million. 35% of the shares last year were put on our books for $1.9 or $1.6 billion of the same organization. 35%. So that gives you an implied value of $4 billion. It's now just been revalued after a little bit of relining and reshuffling to 2.4 billion. So why is it coming down? Because someone wants to buy it. And I believe that's exactly what's going to be offered with the bonds. When the treasury bills or the bonds come up to be honored and the government can't honor them, they're going to start floating them again. And the value is going to be dropping. So we're now compounding and conflating and confusing our land issue. So what's the way forward? The way forward, in my view, is very simple. If you're a citizen of Zimbabwe, you're a citizen of Zimbabwe. That has been passed last year in Parliament. So the 00, which donated you white or a person of color, is no longer there. You can go and get your area's code. So the 0 is there, and I've done mine. That's number one. Number two, If you offer restitution in the current circumstances to people, I believe less than 7% of white commercial farmers will take it. On the black commercial farmers, land is like Mombe's. You sell it as an absolute last resort. So there will be a big uptake there. Compensation should be on a willing seller, willing buyer, providing the money stays in the country, because you want to package it so we cover the whole debt of the country. If you're going to take it, there must be a tax. I know that's not legal, but we've got to play both sides and try and do it. And then we need a tribunal like the SADC tribunal to be reinstated so people have a belief in the future. You want to guarantee for the future. If you're going to invest in this country, you want to guarantee for the future. So if you look at the crops, if you look at the South African export of maize, for the last 5 years, Zimbabwe's bought 500,000 tons every year, on average. We are by far the biggest buyers of South African maize. Irrespective of what we say, I'm just talking the South African export of grain crops. Our maize is 500,000 tons from South Africa over the last 5 years. The crops that were successful are those that where the buyer funded the crops, and those two were mainly in small scale was cotton, and it ran well for 5 years, and then it became a bun fight. Tobacco was funded by, because the banks couldn't fund it, the tobacco companies funded. But there again, we now incur another cost, because if the tobacco company is funding it, he's going to dictate the price, and he's going to give you just enough money for you to get by. Tobacco price this year is down 60 cents on last year. We got a bumper crop this year, but we've got a carryover of 20% from last year. We've got fertilizer, they're talking of doubling in price. Fuel, we know, has gone up 40%. So those are all the negatives. But the positive is, if we take the issues where it's working and we offer it to all individuals fairly, and even if there's a quota, but we've got to do it together. We've got to do it as the white, the black. We've got to do it as the government, as the farmer. We've got to do it in the urban areas and the rural areas so it's comprehensive, so someone will fund it. If it's all mismatched, no one's going to fund it. It's as simple as that. So I just want to mention we have a problem with our debt. And my biggest problem is it's at 23, and we've just had I think it's the Article 4.6 done now. Let's see what that brings us. That'll be in June. And I can tell you now, I can guarantee we're going to have 2 billion added on to our national debt. Okay, because we're going back to my last wrap up. We're actually going back to the colonial era, where we've got the elites ruling, not to the benefit of the people and not to the benefit of the country. It can be argued further that the elites are strangling the country and causing a major problem in the land issue, not only rural, but urban. It's prime urban land and it's prime agricultural land. How many people do we know who buy in peri-urban areas for rural development? The urban master plan should change. We should be going up like Asia and South America, not across. We should be going up. And I disagree with Doc on one point. The only way you can push productivity is if you've got collateral behind you, which is title number 1. However, you tax non-productivity. If someone wants 2,000 acres, you tax him until he grows something on it. And that's the only way we're going to get the production up on grain crops. With that, I'd like to thank you.
Thanks, Rusty. You said a lot there.
Sorry.
Enough to tell us that the land question has been compounded big time. We'll come back to you, but I think Chieza is waiting to say a bit. Chieza, are you there?
Yes, Prof. I'm here patiently waiting.
That's nice.
Sorry, Chieza.
No. If you were talking nonsense, I would have stopped you. I think both of you have really complemented each other in the manner which you have explained. Graciano gave us a historical perspective, and you highlighted the problems which reference which he had made himself in his presentation. So, Chedza, how do we move forward? What's the impact of all this on the economy, and how do we unravel this compound question?
All right. Thank you, Prof. And thank you also as well to the previous speakers. So really, for me, in terms of how we move forward, I think we first of all need to gain a deep appreciation of we need to look at the applicable law, policies, and procedures around urban state land administration as well as agricultural land. And there's been a distortion there. And the other thing that we also need to look at and really need to gain an appreciation of is a clear appreciation of the gap between formal authority, the de jure, and actual centers of power, the de jure versus de facto authority patterns, because we are really seeing parallel networks of power and influence that are influencing this, aspects of what we're discussing today. And finally, we need to deal with the issue of corruption. It's something I always hammer in most of my discussions, but we need to really also look at this from the corruption aspect and how this has really created, what has been termed as an architecture of opacity. So I'll start really with the distortion of the law and how this also then ties in terms of how it affects our economy, right? We really do have one thing about Zimbabwe is that in terms of laws, in terms of policies and procedures, we've got very clear blueprints. We've got very clear mechanisms in place, right? We've got the legal framework. We've got what can arguably be termed a sound legal framework, governing these issues. We start with the constitution there that deals with this aspect under section 293, which covers agricultural land and specifically the alienation of the land by the state, right? And some of these aspects have been spoken to by the previous speakers in terms of how the legal framework for how the state may transfer rights of such land. And under section 293, it says this can be done under one of three circumstances, either through the transfer of ownership, through the granting of a lease, or other right of occupation or use, right? But any such alienation must then be in accordance with section 289. It goes on to stipulate all these grounds under which such alienation must occur. So these provisions must be read conjunctively. And basically the aim there really, in terms of the foundational principles for agricultural land, is to redress historical land imbalances. I think Doc has spoken to that. Ensure equitable access to land for all Zimbabweans, and promote the productive use of land, and ensure fairness and non-discrimination in land allocation. So this then brings us to an important point in terms of how then does this tie in with the impact on our economy. And this is seen through the fact that, one of the critical constraints that are put in place in terms of the legal framework is that within the broader land reform framework is that the state is generally prohibited from alienating more than one piece of agricultural land to the same person and to their dependents in order to ensure a wider distribution of land resources. But are we really seeing this happening in practice? That's the first question. And then when we also look at the fact, so this then is what brings us to this culture of this aspect of corruption and the architecture of opacity, right? And we can go on to the next slide. So how the economy gets to be impacted really is because of how, you know, opacity around this, the appropriation, the allocation, and you know, regulation of state and agricultural land. It's all really, there's a deliberate political ploy there that is being implemented. There's a deliberate political strategy that is being used to engineer a culture of opacity for the purposes of regime survival and elite enrichment. I think the previous speakers have spoken to that. And you know, we're seeing right now a certain oligarch gifting 33 hectares of prime land as a wedding gift like it's nothing, you know. We are having leaked audios being circulated talking about how you know, there's now an emergence of Zimbabwe's new Cecil John Rhodes, a kingmaker of some sort, you know, who wants to take control of everything from land. We're having all these things, yeah, that are busy emerging. It's really, these are interesting times, but we need to juxtapose all this with really where we stand in terms of, you know, for instance, our debt service pressures. They remain high, and all this is reflective of unsustainable public debt and outstanding external arrears. So when we look at how this then affects the economy, what we are saying is that when you see all of these things happening, we shouldn't look at it in isolation, right? We should not look at this in isolation, because at the end of the day, anything that involves instability when it comes to you know, issues such as those that were raised in the Uchena report, which Honorable Rusty Markham really spoke to, they, you know, the whole bypassing of competitive bidding for land, the whole the housing development occurring on unplanned areas, this whole you know, conflation and confusion of issues around agricultural land and urban land as well, because it's not just agricultural. What it then means is that when we're looking at this from an investment perspective, it pushes away investment, and this is at a time when we really need FDI. We are already operating poorly in terms of, you know, compared to our regional counterparts like Mozambique and Zambia when it comes to bringing in investment. And it's all tied into this land issue, right? It's all tied into this land issue. And I want to speak to something very important. When we speak of the issues to do with this kingmaker, right? We spoke of the manipulation of treasury bills and all these things. And we spoke of how this has resulted in patronage networks and how this has resulted in parallel networks of power and influence, and how this then ties into the land issue. When we come to this issue, right, and in terms of its economic impact, we have seen that we have a total public and publicly generated debt that's around approximately 23.4 billion. We are trying to resolve that issue, right, through the arrears clearance and debt resolution structured dialogue process. And that process has got three pillars. It's got the governance reform pillar, it's got the economic reform pillar, and then it's got the land tenure reform pillar. So under this particular pillar now, we must be seen to be taking part in certain reforms, you know, that seek to bring back investor confidence. But unfortunately, all of this is happening in the backdrop of political realities, because we're seeing agricultural, urban, and peri-urban state allocation, land allocation, being increasingly associated with these patronage systems, with corruption, with political favoritism that often supersede formal legal institutions. And then we're also seeing the futility of institutions of combating corruption in terms of dealing with the land issue. We've got the Zimbabwe Land Commission, we've got the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, we've got other prosecutorial bodies which are all failing to deal with this, with issues of SABOCO deals with issues of land barons. And yet at the same time, we're on these international platforms, so you've got these bodies such as the IMF, and we're trying to work on these staff monitored programs. So we really need to, there's that contradiction, right? There is that contradiction where on the one hand, we're trying to create macroeconomic stability, and yet at the same time, we have a government that is presently engaging in self-defeatist maneuvers, right, by allowing these patronage networks to really take control of to really like to hoard, you know, these natural resources, to essentially engage in green extractivism, right? So that culture of opacity, which I referred to initially, which basically refers to the a cohesive system that I can say designed to capture national wealth and natural resources for elite enrichment, while purposefully and systemically dismantling any possibility of accountability or transparency, is what has led us to where we are today. I won't go into detail in terms of, you know, the Fast Track Land Reform Program 2000, ISAP, and all that context which has been touched on in detail by Doc. But when we look recently, as from 2017, when you know, let's say under the administration of the current president, who then came into place and then started going into these agreements, like the BIPPA agreements, as part of a mechanism of redressing, you know, the economic and political legacies of the Fast Track Land Reform Program, you find that there's lack of genuineness in these processes, both on the part of the government that is entering into these agreements, and also on the part of the Western or external or international bodies that are seeking to facilitate, you know, because what we are finding, if you look at this, is that this actually has Western backing, right? It has Western backing mostly to secure interests, of, you know, their people within Zimbabwe, in terms of making sure that they remain having access, making sure that this elite network of people, of civilians, of private citizens rather, remains having access to a huge portion of the land, to the expense or you know, of the majority. So we are on the one hand trying to deal with the economic impact, trying to attract foreign direct investment, trying to result in macroeconomic stability, trying to, you know, fix our economy. But at the same time, we are really seeing these contradictions, really, that go against some of the objectives that are being advanced at that level. And if we're to look at the way forward, I would say that in terms of how best to deal with these things, and I always go back to saying, you know, we really need to start at this from how deeply entrenched this whole system has been. We have seen steps to try and redress these situations, but at the end of the day, we really need to go back to the institutions. Let's start first with how we can really look at this from an institutional perspective. So for me, I'm sorry, are we going slide by slide here? Where are we? Yes, governance by demolition. So these are just part of the contradictions. We saw the structures that, for example, Marlborough shops, they being demolished under the guise that, you know, aesthetically they do not they do not fit the whole modern, you know, aspect of a modern city, under the fact that, you know, they were not really there was, the land was designated for other use, and all this. Selective application of the law is another issue, which I'll touch on. But what we want to really get at here, and is that, you know, what we are seeing basically is that there are no genuine efforts at the present moment to really deal with this land issue. It remains unresolved because it fuels political mileage. It gains it fuels political mileage for the elite. It ensures regime survival. It ensures elite enrichment. So there's never really going to be a genuine effort at addressing these issues, despite their involvement in all these other initiatives, such as being on the debt resolution and arrears clearance structured dialogue platform, despite this return of 60-something farms, BIPPA farms, despite all these other initiatives, because they are doing all that whilst at the same time engaging in such things such as institutional capture, whilst at the same time we're seeing development on areas such as wetlands, on protected areas such as wetlands, whilst at the same time we're seeing demolitions of structures, whilst at the same time we're seeing MPs being allocated lands, members of parliament. We've seen independent reports there citing systemic illegal allocation of urban land to members of parliament, which sort of overrides parliament's oversight role, because now they feel beholden to the state for all of these things. So all these institutions that really should be institutions of oversight on this land issue are crippled because of political influence, right? So going forward, what we need to really do is to decentralize this issue of corruption, right? We really need to go back to some of the findings of the Uchena report. There were very good recommendations and findings that were made there, and they also speak to this issue of corruption. It actually highlights this very issue that Uchena report, in terms of saying, government must really put in place mechanisms of ensuring that corruption does not, of regulating these issues of corruption, especially on the part of urban councils, and also especially in part of the parceling out of agricultural land, and really putting in place those vehicles, right, of ensuring that there's proper regulation, there's proper audit of these, there's proper invoicing, and there's proper valuation, and all these issues, right? So we then need to go back to also, in addition to dealing with the issue of corruption, we then need to go back to the issue of compensation and interest. I think Honorable Rusty has spoken to great length on the issue of, the restitution, compensation, the pros and cons of that. But, there's also a counter narrative to all of these things, in terms of how, whilst we can be speaking of, for example, this whole $3.5 billion agreement that was entered into by our government, at the end of the day, we can look at this in terms of how it looks like at face value, and how it ends up emerging in practice, how it ends up emerging in reality and on the ground, right? So what we are seeing, for example, with this issue of compensation and interest, in as much as it is a good move, and I think for pleasing international investors, as Doc said initially, there are key challenges in all of this. And one of the key challenges when we look at is, how can we sustain really a $3.5 billion commitment, which is also competing with other societal needs and priorities. What it ends up doing is that in terms of our economy, we will end up really, it constrains access to affordable financing and debt service costs, which ends up really crowding our priority, in terms of crowding out priority investment and social spending or protection, right? Because you have these competing interests at the end of the day, and they are not really people-centered as well. They do not have the people at the center. When we're thinking of these initiatives, they do not really have the betterment of the economy at their very core when they are being implemented. So really the problem also is in implementation. So I've said that the problem is with corruption, which needs to be decentralized. The problem is with the institutions that we have put in place as well for combating corruption, in terms of them being able to adequately deal with the unresolved land issue. How do they adequately deal with this issue when faced with individuals who put themselves there saying that, well, I'm actually the one who gets consulted in terms of these issues and that issue. I can personally summon, the entire cabinet to a private, family function, which ends up really looking like a roll call of who's who at the end of the day. So all of these, in terms of these institutions, it ends up affecting the debt and reform processes that we are trying to get into. Right now, as has been said, we have a debt that sits at approximately 23.4 billion, which equates to roughly 43 to 47% of the country's GDP. That's something that we really need to sit with. And it's in the form of external debt, which accounts for the huge part of this, at around 18.2, and you have the domestic debt there, which then accounts for the remaining balance, right, at approximately 8.3 to about 10.2 billion. So when we then enter into these platforms, such as this one, which was launched in 2022, are we then entering into these platforms with genuine reforms at hand? And also at the same time, what we need to consider in terms of the enforcement issue, in terms of the enforcement and implementation issue, what we really need to look at is how the issue of these staff monitored programs, it's a very good initiative. It's a low-hanging fruit, but it may dangerously take us back to the ESAP type of setup that we had before. So you've got the wet and dry SMPs, right, under this platform. And this is also something that I want to speak of in terms of the impact on our economy. So you've got, under this data and reform matrix, we've got the wet SMPs and the dry SMPs. And these speak to really a reform program. They speak to a distinction, which matters really in terms of trying to convince creditors such as the IMF and the World Bank that we as Zimbabwe can actually implement sound economic reforms insofar as the land issue is concerned. So the dry SMP is really, that's just a reform program that is monitored by the IMF, but it comes with no money, right? And this is not really the one that government would want to have. They would, it basically, it doesn't really result in any funding being dispersed during the program. And, it is, you just see the IMF agreeing with the government on economic reforms, for example, reducing inflation, controlling spending, stabilizing the currency, those kind of things. And we have previously had dry SMPs where the IMF monitored reforms but did not lend money because Zimbabwe still had arrears and lacked creditor confidence. But the one that's really mostly interesting is the wet SMP, which is, wet is really just a phrase. It's really, it refers to the fact that it comes with money attached to it. So the wet SMPs refers to a government program, to a reform program, which is linked to financing or donor resources, even if indirectly, right? So under this particular dialogue that we're seeing, we'll be talking about an IMF monitor program that can unlock financing, grants or donor support, or things like, pre-arrears clearance funding, and eventually renewed access to, concessional international loans after arrears are cleared, right? So government has previously referred to resource mobilization for a wet SMP as part of their roadmap towards clearing these arrears and economic re-engagement, right? But now, at the same time, like we're saying, that as they are busy trying to negotiate under these international platforms, how then does it weigh in terms of building investor confidence when at the same time we have these contradictions? We spoke about the 33 hectares, but that's just really one of the individuals. And he only mentioned just that one piece of land. Imagine just how much more land that is not being publicly declared is involved in that. We once saw divorce proceedings before between the former, president's daughter and her now estranged husband, and that read like basically if ever there was anything that exposed just how pervasive this issue is, you saw the properties being listed there, hectares and hectares of land. Basically, they own the entire, I think it was the Crow Hill area. And yet we've got these mechanisms in place that say we cannot be seen to be dispersing land to more than one parcel of land to just one person and to their dependents. And yet this is exactly what is happening. So it becomes, for me, I have a problem there, because I feel that even these international bodies that are here trying to facilitate these processes are also taking advantage, because what it means is that Zimbabweans are really essentially on their own. Both processes, both entities, the parties that are involved in these platforms are coming in there with their elitist agendas, which really do not have the public at heart. So we really need to go back at looking at these things from an aspect that that is people-centered, first of all, and that involves really undoing some of these structural issues, these structural barriers. And I know this takes time, but we can really speak about issues such as addressing this from in terms of a way forward perspective, we can really speak about this in terms of really not just addressing some of the issues that were raised in the Uchena report, but it needs to be a very holistic approach that looks at that basically looks at, preventing this era of extractivism that we're looking at. It really requires a fundamental shift in approach where we must really move beyond technical fixes and just directly challenge the coercive political structures built from the outset to undermine accountability, built from the outset to create an architecture of opacity. And until we dismantle that architecture of opacity, the wealth and the enrichment that is generated for the elite through these means will continue to really have a significant bearing on, in terms of, it will continue to have a significant bearing really in terms of the economic outlook and the economic trajectory of the country, right? And it's also difficult because even when you look at the global governance initiatives that are being put in place to address this, they often end up becoming insufficient because that very same opacity is actively and deliberately produced by powerful political insecurity structures. So simply demanding things like financial disclosures, simply demanding things like audits of lifestyle audits and things like that is on its own not enough. There needs to be structural transformation. There really needs to be structural transformation for us to really start seeing very real gains on the ground regarding addressing this continuously or persistent unresolved land issue.
Thank you.
As well as also dealing with the parallel financial structures and their associated arrangements.
Thanks, Chieza. You really depress us now, especially since we have said it repeatedly here, that it appears that the system has no capacity to reform. Your presentation points at the need for structural reforms within which the land question itself can be tackled. So it's really a depressing outcome. Now we have come to the end of our session. I just want some last words from Rusty and our main speaker, Graciano. Rusty, very briefly, less than a minute, what is the way forward on this particular problem? Especially to the extent to which the whole issue of compensation, as you outlined, is linked to the debt arrears clearance. Are we getting anywhere with that? You are muted, Rusty. You are muted.
Sorry, I'm afraid, Prof, I don't see any relief on the debt management side. I'm hoping we'll get relief from the financial institutes. But bottom line, on the way forward, I would look at a national debt package with guarantees, which includes the compensation and the land. It's toxic to talk about land because everyone gets political immediately. What we've got to do is copy someone like East and West Germany when they merged. That was as communist you can get, and as capitalistic. And 20 years they've merged their land policy. You don't have to be a brain surgeon, just copy what they did. And that makes sure everyone's treated fairly and we're not the guinea pigs. Someone else has done it before us. That's the way I'd do it, but I'd also encompass a whole national debt, and that comes with good management. And unfortunately for the good management, we've got to get rid of corruption. The issue we have is very simple. We must get away from talking of land and fast track and colonial past. And now what we've got to do is start looking more at a conglomeration of state land management. And that state land management must include urban, rural, communal, and it must be a policy that you can fund and finance internationally and sell to the donors. No one's going to give us money if we don't solve the problem. As simple as that. And we can't solve the problem if we've got corruption. The easiest way to sort out corruption is anyone who flashes anything, you ask them to show you their tax returns. Thank you.
Were you at the wedding, Rusty?
I think the letter is still in the post.
Okay. Okay. Graciano, last word from you. Are there any historical precedents with respect to the resolution of the land question? You made reference to the fact that land issues are always elite driven. It's a class issue. Is there any hope for us developing some kind of initiative, some kind of capacity to resolve what has clearly become a compounded problem? Complex, rotten, one might say, on the back of a rotten elite, a rotten cabal. Where would you start, Graciano?
Yeah, I did get the first part of your question, so I'm nearly.
The first question was whether, from your studies and your research, there are any precedents with respect to the resolution of the land problem in other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Latin America, for example. Rusty just mentioned Germany as an example, or the former socialist countries. How has this thing been resolved?
I think unfortunately, the trajectory is changing. I think if you look at the land reforms in Japan, the land reforms in America, and the earlier German, the Juncker path, which were really about addressing the agrarian question, the state is always an important player in these things. The Japanese land question was addressed through American occupation under General MacArthur, when the landlords were essentially removed in favor of the sort of people who were using usufruct rights there. And I think in Zimbabwe, I mean, I'm a supporter of the land reform program, never mind its iniquities and the problems associated with it, because land reforms are by their nature very expensive. The figures that Rust was talking about, if, for example, under the Uchena Report, you wanted to all those billions paid, Zimbabwe is an illiquid environment, for example. If you wanted all that urban land that was acquired, that the Uchena Report says is up to 3 billion, there's not that kind of liquidity in Zimbabwe. I believe that we often don't talk about the urban land question and the poor. Never mind the rentals and stuff. We have entire suburbs across Zimbabwe now. Look at Arrears South, Hopley, and other places. Those are people who did what we call self-provisioning. Very unpalatable for people who are pro-order and organized, whatever. There is land inflation across Zimbabwe's urban areas that prices out poor people out of owning property. So I think urban land occupations are a pathway to gaining property in the absence of any financing or the city council playing a traditional role of allocating land to the urban poor. Now, is it a perfect path? No. It's not a perfect path, but it has allowed the creation of what one would call disorderly townships. But don't underestimate the importance of those places. I think Hopley and other new places, these are places where people have found somewhere to put their head in the absence of financing. So I think we should appreciate that the poor are gaining access to land through informal ways, never mind the land barons and others, because of the land inflation. It's not a perfect model. But if I were poor, I would appreciate that informality. And it helped to some extent to address the in Zimbabwe, especially where so-called war veteran groups were occupying peri-urban land and also, charging people some rentals and all that. But I think fundamental to this is that a lot of the people from the urban poor have access to some kind of land. I think the benefits now are seen. The ZANU-PF government is playing a role in officializing some of these places and giving them some kind of title. And I think I want to see some kind of title coming to them, never mind the way they gained access to land in the absence of financing. Look, the benefits of paying compensation, I'm yet to be convinced that the benefits of paying compensation to Zimbabwe are dubious, because it's an expensive process. Look at the $3 billion agreement to pay off white farmers. Where does that money come from in the absence of the Americans and the British compensating? We don't have the money. Rusty just gave us astounding figures, over nearly billions and billions of dollars that are required. Where is that money coming from? And how much has Zimbabwe gotten from international finance institutions such as the IMF in terms of goodwill after agreeing to compensation? Completely zero. Under this BIPPA arrangement, how much is Zimbabwe going to gain after agreeing to return those funds? It's doubtful if we are going to gain any lot of finance in terms of goodwill from the so-called international community. So one has to look at the path Zimbabwe had explored, minus the corruption and other things highlighted. I think we were on a good path where the economy has been reasonably indigenized, minus other problems. And I think this idea that Zimbabwe's problems will be resolved through FDI is a foregone. There's no money in Europe, for example, for those kinds of things. The idea that our economy will benefit from the IMF and all that in the age of Trump and others, there's never going to be those large-scale financial investments in Zimbabwe. We should look into building a cohort of indigenous capitalists, the Dangotes and others, who can be the anchor capitalists in indigenizing the economy. Of course, we have specific problems in Zimbabwe with some of our indigenous capitalists misbehaving, but that doesn't mean that we should not promote the emergence of indigenous capitalists. I think the compensation is misdirected, because I don't think we're going to gain anything from compensation. The idea that we're going to see a lot of financial inflows through FDI is questionable. I think we should have stayed away from compensation, pursued the idea that the Americans or either the British would be able to intervene in terms of these problems, because they showed a historic burden in addressing this. So for me, I'm doubtful about the benefits of compensation. The IMF is trying to come in here and they're imposing conditionalities that if we give up BIPPA farms, we are going to get money through the staff monitored program. That is still dubious. The benefits of IMF-sponsored programs across Africa are questionable. I have not seen any country that have gone through a staff monitored program and went back to economic prosperity. I think we're gonna see more austerity minus any financing that addresses the huge economic and social problems we have in this country. I think because the economy is already indigenized, why do we need outside capital? I think we just have to lessen corruption and pursue policies that promotes an inward-looking economy with a bit of external investment. How have we survived in the last 20 years? We have survived without that kind of funding. Where are we now? We are not terribly far behind our regional peers, for example. How is Zambia, that has not been under sanctions, compared to Zimbabwe in terms of their GDP? Of course, we have an informal banking sector, but our economy is doing reasonably okay given our isolation from the international financial markets. So I don't agree with the idea that we should carry favor with these Western institutions and get funding, because we're not going to get the money anyhow. They don't believe Zimbabwe is the right place to invest. So I doubt if this is a good move.
Thank you. I think on that note, and we have overrun the time now, about 10 minutes. I want to, before I thank the three presenters, I just want to bring to your attention, and in doing so, thank Glenn Hunter, who's one of our regulars from the Campbell Foundation. She sent us a document which came late this afternoon. I meant to send it to all of you, but it's a summary of the land audits over the last years, from the Flora Booker right down to the Uchena Report. And I just noting, for example, the major findings. And I know you, Garasti said these reports are secret, but somehow people are getting a hold of them. For example, the Uchena Report 2003, major findings: multiple farm ownership, underutilization, administrative failures, unlawful occupations, and so on and so forth. And it goes on, the same thing. BIPPA protected farm stake and export processing zone, and so on and so forth. So I'll send this to all of you. I'll ask Tony to do that by email. But it shows or reflects the complexity of this problem, this land question in Zimbabwe. I really hope that the recommendations that the three of you have made, that those in the state will look at them. We have a new permanent secretary, the Minister of Lands, the new Minister of Lands, who is one of your group, Graciano, Prosper Matondi. I'll send him the notice for this session. I hope he is listening. But I think it would be very useful to share this session with the likes of Matondi and others. And we have to resolve this issue. We are really on our own for many reasons. I agree with Graciano that it is unlikely. It's unlikely that there will be a reconciliation between Zimbabwe state and the international financial institutions. And not only because the Zimbabwe state is incapable of reform, but also because the climate out there has changed. The Trumps are not interested in these issues anymore. And I'm not sure that we should pursue that agenda. But at the same time, the need for reform is loud. And on that note, just to tell you that our next session on the 11th of June will be on the shadow state, the states within a state, and the implications thereof for Zimbabwe, and the dire need for interventionist policies that can redeem our country from what appears to be a really, really messy situation. So I thank you, Graciano, Rusty, Chiesa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.